Hey, my name's Paul Bevan, mortgage broker and investment property specialist. Today I wanted to run you through something called the property clock, which most people that have bought or sold or invest in real estate will probably be familiar with. It's used by a lot of various analysts and research and industry participants. And I just want to talk a little bit about it today and discuss where each of the capital cities are, in particular Queensland, and have a bit of a chat about some of the influences on the property cycle. So hopefully you can all see my diagram up there on the whiteboard, which basically looks like a clock. So at the top, at 12 o'clock, we've got the peak of the market. Down at 6 o'clock, we've obviously got the trough. Now, the clock's basically divided into quadrants. So we've got from that, 12 around to 3, the area of the clock that we would consider the downturn in the market. And this can last from anywhere up to 2 years. As you can see at the moment, Melbourne and Sydney are probably just past that peak and into the downturn there. Darwin, Canberra and Perth have probably been in that downturn phase for quite a bit longer and are looking to move out of there shortly. From 3 o'clock round to 6 o'clock is the stagnation phase. This can last anywhere up to 3 years or more. A good example of that or markets in that phase are Hobart and Adelaide. Again, they've been sort of moving around back and forth within that stagnation phase, coming close to the trough and looking at recovery and then pulling back again. At the trough, we can see there at 6 o'clock. We then go from 6 o'clock around to 9 o'clock, which is the recovery phase. Again, this can last from anywhere up to 1 or 1.5 years. At the moment, speaking of Queensland, this is where we see the Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast markets at the moment. Obviously, a lot of new development going on in those markets and a lot of infrastructure spend as well. So up on the Sunshine Coast, obviously we've got the hospital area and the gentrification and rejuvenation of Maroochydore and the town centre there. On the Gold Coast, again, a lot of infrastructure spend, a lot of it related to the Commonwealth Games coming up in 2018. Infrastructure spend is an interesting one. To have a long-lasting effect on price, it really must lead to a long-term increase in jobs. So just need to be careful there when you're looking at infrastructure spend within an area. Okay, going from 9 o'clock up to 12 o'clock, that's obviously our upturn in the market, and typically that can last up to a year. Melbourne and Sydney obviously having just gone through that phase. Now, Brisbane's just entered into that phase now. So if you're looking at the next 12 months, Brisbane is potentially a market to keep an eye on. Again, there's a lot of construction and a lot of spend occurring in Brisbane at the moment, which is obviously one of the influences as well. Now, I also just wanted to talk about the actual property cycle. Typically, most analysts would suggest, and historically they would suggest it lasts for around 7 years to go through this cycle, right around the clock. A number of experts think this might now be shortening to closer to 5 years. Now that's due to a number of reasons, but one of them is certainly the availability of information. So obviously via the internet, the availability of information, whether that's on a specific property, particular area, happenings in the area in terms of news, etc. There's a whole range of factors there. Now, talking about the property cycle, there's a number of key influences on the property cycle as well. They can basically be broken down into 2 or 3 categories. Some of the cyclical influences are things like interest rates, which are obviously at historical lows at the moment, and ease of access to funds. That's an interesting one because it's just tightened up recently, obviously for investors, particularly in the past 6 to 12 months, given the number of regulations imposed by APRA on some of our lending institutions. Population growth is another cyclical influence, as is market confidence as well. Typically, you won't see any positive news stories in the press about the property market. It's always negative. So you just need to be a little bit wary of who you're listening to and where you're getting your information from. One of the other areas is structural, and this relates to things like employment. Obviously, the unemployment rate is something to track there, but also specifically in particular areas. So employment that's being created, jobs being created, etc. Taxes and rules is another structural influence, such as things such like self-managed super funds, regulations changing, foreign investment, those sorts of things there. Infrastructure is one that we've mentioned already, and demographics as well. So obviously the demographics within a particular area has an influence too, particularly on the product. Now the other area is what we call the X factor area, and this is something that's potentially it's difficult to account for. A good example of this is international influences. So that could be through overseas buying or overseas investors. Another one that is difficult to, well, it's impossible to have any control over and can have an impact on the market is obviously the exchange rate as well. Just finally, if we're referring to Queensland, as we mentioned earlier, the Commonwealth Games is another X factor, and how the infrastructure spend there will affect those markets, particularly Brisbane. Okay, so in summary, just wanted to give you a brief overview of the property clock and the property cycle at the moment. Again, if we're just having a look at the clock there, we go from the peak at 12 o'clock down to the trough at 6 o'clock, through those 4 quadrants, going through the downturn, stagnation, coming into a recovery phase, and then the upturn. Obviously at the moment, just talking about Queensland, Brisbane just coming into that upturn market, Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast recovering well, and again there's a lot of spend going on in those areas. Again, just touching on the other capitals, Melbourne and Sydney just passing the peak and moving into the downturn. Darwin, Canberra and Perth still in that downturn phase, looking to come out shortly, and Hobart and Adelaide just swinging around in that stagnation phase still. Okay, well that's everything from me today. Hopefully that gave you some information in terms of the property clock and the property cycle. If you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch. Give me a call on 0433 994 693.